Coming up on Theater Talk.
Broadway becomes more and more exclusively a business for the wealthy. Whether it was the money being spent on Spider-Man or the limited run of Glengarry Glen Ross, where tickets go for $400, $500, $600 a pop, we know that only a certain class can afford those shows. So the box office numbers go up. Does the art go up? I don't really think so.
Theater Talk is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation. From New York City, this is Theater Talk. I'm Susan Haskins.
And I'm Michael Riedel of the New York Post. Now, you know, Susan, there's a great theater that I always felt was a little underappreciated and undervalued in this town for a long time. The American Place Theater, created by Wynn Handman.
Yes, although at one point it was the hottest theater in town, which
it was, but it's sort of, when I came along, it had kind of been eclipsed by some of the other theaters. But it has been brought back to a position of prominence with a fine new book about Wynn Handman and his theater. It is called Wynn Place Show, and it's by my very good friend, great colleague, mentor of mine in many ways as a reporter, Gerard. Welcome to Theater Talk, Jeremy.
Great to be here.
So, all right, so I didn't get the subtitle of Wynn Place Show, but it's a good subtitle. Can you give it to us?
The subtitle is A Biased History of the Rollicking Life and Extreme Times of Wynn Handman and the American Place Theater.
How rollicking and extreme was it in your research?
Well, let's consider the fact that Sam Shepard's first full-length play, which was called La Turista, involved killing a chicken on stage every night on the stage of their original theater, which was in a church, St. Clement's Church, way far west on West 46th Street.
And a chicken was really killed?
Well, after the letters started pouring in, Wynn suggested that they might find an alternative way of staging this effect. It didn't assuage the feelings of the customers that, in fact, a chicken was not being killed, but there it was.
So what is it, what was the inspiration or the reason for Wynn to create this theater?
Wynn came out of the service after the war feeling like he wanted to accomplish something. He started taking classes with Sanford Meisner at the Neighborhood Playhouse, which was a place of great theatrical ferment. A lot of people came out of that group, and Wynn actually became a protege of Meisner, a teacher himself. And all of this was around the time that Broadway, to a certain class of theater people, represented the evil empire.
Right.
And Wynn wanted to create a theater for not Broadway, not just off Broadway, but he wanted to create a theater for great American writers who were not then writing for the theater. And as a kind of great happenstance, he fell in with the crowd from the New York Review of Books, which was just beginning to form. This is in the very early 60s, the late 50s, early 60s. And Robert Lowell, whose wife, Elizabeth Hardwick, was a big deal at the New York Review of Books. Robert Lowell, the great American poet, had a play that was making the rounds of agents at the time. It was a big work. It was a triptych of plays based on stories by Herman Melville, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and nobody wanted to produce it. And Wynn heard about it, and a sort of light went off, and he and his great partner, Sidney Lanier, who had been an Episcopal priest at St. Thomas's on Fifth Avenue and had managed to secure this little theater on West 46th Street that was dying. This play called The Old Glory became their first
How was that
show.
play received, The Old Glory?
Well, it had a very young Frank Langella and a very young Roscoe Lee Brown, who unfortunately passed away recently. And it was received as a kind of success d'estime. It was acknowledged that it was really, really great that a literary personality of this stature had written something for the theater, even though, frankly, it was kind of a mess. However, it was also the first piece directed by Dr. Jonathan Miller, who was here appearing on Broadway and had just begun to decided to make his mark as a director. And of course, he went on to become the great opera director that we know. But his first show was the old glory.
But the actors had some problems with him, didn't they not?
The actors were a little bit confused by him. He was finding his own style as a director, and these were big plays. Even they would have been big plays on Broadway, let alone this little church stage. And so there was a little bit of subterfuge with Wynn and some of his colleagues going in and kind of directing things on the side so that the actors knew what their blocking was supposed to be, because these things hadn't apparently occurred to Jonathan Miller yet.
What was it about Broadway that someone like Wynn Handman hated? What was Broadway like then that made them turn against it? Because I think of Broadway at that time, you have Arthur Miller and Tennessee Williams, you know, major writers on Broadway.
It's true, and it's one of the things I address in the book, that Broadway was not entirely the evil empire that Wynn made it out to be, but the commercialization of the art form, which really came down to Wynn through Meisner and the group theater and those fervent year types. He realized correctly that the Arthur Millers and even the Tennessee Williamses were anomalous at the time, and that most of Broadway was pretty brainless, and that the great American writers were not writing for the Broadway theater. And he wanted to tap into that. You have to understand also there was a political connection. This is a story that begins really with Myrna Loy and ends with John Leguizamo and Bill Irwin and most recently Asif Mandvi, all of whom came through the American Place Theater.
And Eric Bogosian and
Eric Bogosian and these amazing writers and actors. Myrna Loy was a beloved star of the screen. She had never done any theater acting. She was also very politically active. She was involved in Adlai Stevenson's presidential campaign, which is where she met Wynn's wife, Bobby Handman, Barbara, who also very sadly died just a few weeks ago. Through an ICM agent named Bodie Boatwright,
yeah, sure, I know.
Myrna Loy got put together with Wynn, and they decided that she would do a straw hat circuit tour of actually a Broadway matinee comedy to make a lot of money. Myrna made a lot of money, and Wynn made a lot of money, and it really provided the seed money
to begin
for the American Place.
And then Myrna was loyal to Wynn and to the
loyal
right through, right?
Until her death.
Also going on at this time, of course, Joe Papp is creating the Shakespeare Festival and the Public Theater. What was Wynn's relationship with Papp and the Public Theater? Were these rival impresarios of the off-Broadway world at the time? Probably
my favorite quote in the book from Wynn is when he says, he admired and loved Joe, and he loved what came out of there, but he recognized that it was not his place. He said, "I would never have called my theater the Public Theater. I was much too elitist." He was aiming for something very, very different. He didn't want the public, and in fact, one of the first innovations of the many that came out of the American Place Theater was the idea of a subscription audience, that in the beginning you couldn't buy single tickets. You had to sign on for the whole journey, as it were, and commit yourself to the idea, the concept, even if you didn't like killing chickens on stage or Eric Bogosian spouting obscenities or the craziness, if you had the opportunity to see the single performance of Cowboy Mouth with Sam Shepard and Patti Smith, before Sam said to himself, "Oh my God, this is way too personal," and he left.
That's right, he just abandoned
that was the end of the show.
Well, he was having an affair with Patti Smith, and he was married to Oland Johnson Shepard, and he freaked out and left, And Wynn is very funny.
Newborn child in there somewhere, too.
So, but was it a total free-for-all at this place? I mean, were they disciplined performers?
Oh, I don't think it was a free-for-all at all in terms of the product. In terms of the work that they were doing, Wynn is one of the most highly regarded teachers in the history of American theater. He still, in his 90s, teaches 2 night classes a week that students have to audition for and are happy to get into. He has a very, very disciplined approach, and he has a very keen ear for talent, whether it's acting talent or writing talent. And indeed, when the American Place Theater was finally superseded by the groups that are now more familiar, like
Manhattan
Playwrights Horizons and Manhattan Theater Club and Second Stage. The American Place became an educational organization called Literature to Life, where Wynn takes his students, it's still very much in operation, and takes contemporary texts and boils them down to 2 to 3 hour long monologues delivered by these students who go take them around to schools. It's actually quite exciting.
Wynn has a very nurturing sensibility. I was lucky enough to work with him myself, and he supports writers, and really his sensibility is so nurturing, but it led away from him being, he was not an empire builder.
That's exactly right, and that's the key, one of the key differences between Wynn and Joe Papp too, that Wynn was not a great promoter of the American Place or his writers, and the writers tended to move on. And indeed,
where they could make more money or
indeed,
something.
one of the longer contributions in the book is from Andre Bishop, who started as a student of Wynn's, loves Wynn, loves what the American Place stood for, but now as the head of Lincoln Center Theater, and of course before that at Playwrights Horizons, he talked about how really kind of removed from the scene Wynn always was. And even though they co-produced, when he was at Playwrights Horizons, they co-produced 2 shows together, Andre acknowledged that it was difficult to get Wynn down to his theater. And I think that was part of why eventually there was a flow of writers away from the theater.
And he also lost his theater space.
And then he lost his theater space to the Roundabout.
What did he make of people like Andre and Joe Papp and the Manhattan Theater Club, these places that suddenly got what I call Broadway-itis, where they all wanted to be on Broadway and they all wanted to have their Tony Awards? And even Joe, who would say Broadway is bleep, loved to play the role of Mr. Producer with his camel hair coat draped over his shoulders.
Wynn has no problem with that because he doesn't feel competitive with it. That's one of the extraordinary things about him. His generosity of spirit it's one of the things that comes across in every single interview in the book. Almost invariably, the first or second or third sentence is, Wynn is the greatest gentleman of the theater I've ever known. And he would simply say, those plays are not for me. The plays that Manhattan Theater Club and Playwrights Horizons produce don't need to be produced by me. And so he was producing shows like George Tabori's plays, The Cannibals, which was set in Auschwitz, or Pinkville, which was about Vietnam and starred a very young Michael Douglas, a really strong anti-Vietnam play. Of course, Joe Papp did anti-Vietnam plays too, but for the most part, he would say, those plays didn't need me.
It's kind of ironic now. I think the old space, the American Place Theater where I knew it, is now owned by the Roundabout.
Right.
And they do things like, Matthew Broderick and the Nerd.
Well, and they did eventually start the Basement series, the Roundabout.
Black Box.
They have a black box here that's produced some of the most important work that we've seen in recent years, as did Lincoln Center Theater with their little theater on top of the Beaumont. They're all great places. My beef with the Roundabout is that there's no acknowledgement that the theater that they're in at 6th Avenue and West 46th Street was built for the American Place Theater. It was part of a project under the Lindsay administration where they subsidized landlords who were building up big office towers on the west side.
Right.
In exchange for more floor space, they could build public spaces. And so 4 theaters came out of that. The Minskoff,
right.
the Uris, which is now the Gershwin, so 2 big commercial theaters, Circle and the Square, which is underneath the Gershwin, and the only original space, which was the American Place Theater. And it was an architectural gem when it opened in 1971. The great architecture critic from the Times, Ada Louise Huxtable, wrote at glorious length about what an important space it was. It had innovations in lighting, in the way that the stage worked, and of course it had this history. It had been now around for nearly 10 years of doing these amazing shows that you had otherwise to go below 14th Street to see.
Right. And did Wynn help design the theater?
Yes, he did. He was very involved in it.
So he was
It was made to his specifications.
Huh. But he's been completely forgotten by this.
You can read 10 histories of off-Broadway and see no mention of the American Place. This little theater that won the Obie, Best Play Obie, it's 5 first seasons out. It's extraordinary.
Can you just give us a couple of productions that you saw when you came to New York and you started making your way as a critic?
When I started going there in 1968, and Wynn was way ahead of his time in promoting women playwrights and promoting playwrights of color. So one of the first things I saw was a trilogy of plays by Ed Bullins, who had been higher up in the Black Panthers and had become a playwright and was writing these furiously angry plays about what was going on in race in New York City and in Black America. And he had been a protege of Woody King Jr., who had founded his own theater, but found refuge at the American Place. And Woody is one of Wynn's closest friends. And so they were producing these very, very fiery plays. He produced Anne Sexton, the poet Anne Sexton's only play. And of course, he produced, not to suggest that everything was fire-breathing, after Robert Lowell's play had been done, he brought in another Harvard poet who had written a lovely play about growing up in Brooklyn called Hogan's Goat that starred Faye Dunaway in her first major role, and that was a big hit. Later on, they had some huge hits with Eric Bogosian doing his first monologues, John Leguizamo doing Mambo Mouth. Asif Manvi's first play was called Sakina's Restaurant. That was an American Place Theater production.
Did American Place Theater profit from any of these shows that were big hits that may have gone on to have a life elsewhere? Or was
well, the simple answer is no.
Well, because the theater's so he was really not about the money, not about...
That's right.
Not about the deal, not about the...
No, he was about the relationship.
Fascinating. Well, I have you here in the hot seat. I want to get your opinion on some of the larger issues going on in the theater. You were for many, many years one of the best theater critics. Bloomberg, I think, let you go wrongfully. What do you think is happening to criticism, theater criticism, today? I mean, is your profession a thing of the past?
Well, it's certainly not a thing of the past if you read the blogs. Everybody's a critic, and that may be one of the things that's affected us. I have to say that Bloomberg, where I had 8 really fantastic years as drama critic and human rights columnist and did lots of great work, decided to reconceive, I will say, its culture coverage, and that reconception didn't include me and a number of the other critics. So it wasn't aimed exclusively at theater, but the irony for me is that the day before we were given the information that we no longer worked at Bloomberg, I spoke at a dinner honoring Michael Feingold, who had been let go after nearly 42 years as the senior critic of the Village Voice. So it's a profession in dire straits in a larger profession of print and online journalism that's in somewhat dire straits.
But what's ironic, I think, though, is that in my covering Broadway and the theater for going on over 20 years now, the theater has never been bigger. I mean, these are huge global hits, these shows. Broadway is doing massive amounts of money. Places like the Roundabout, Manhattan Theater Club have become empires of themselves. So you would think that newspapers would value somebody who covers the theater as well as you do, covering this industry that is going through a tremendous growth.
Well, I would say that with the exception of a very few still honored places, and I would include the New York Times in that, where the critics really do have an independent voice, I think most papers, most venues are interested in critics or in writers about entertainment who will be part of the advertising sales force. And that what you just mentioned about the big business, Broadway becomes more and more exclusively a business for the wealthy. It's something I've written about throughout my entire career, but most frequently and regularly at Bloomberg, because it served a financial community. But I wrote about the money that was, whether it was the money being spent on Spider-Man or the limited run of Glengarry Glen Ross, where tickets go for $400, $500, $600 a pop. We know that only a certain class can afford those shows. So the box office numbers go up. Does the art go up? I don't really think so. And the blockbusters that you talk about can really be counted on the fingers of one hand.
Do you? I mean, it's a free market world, and you know, Scott Rudin, if he's got Daniel Craig, can charge whatever he wants to charge and get for it. That I understand. But you must have seen the escalation of ticket prices over the course of your career. Does it bother you? Does it shock you?
As I said, it shocks me. It disturbs me, and I felt always that it was my responsibility to write about that. Not all my colleagues shared that feeling, but when, for example, they tried to extend the tryouts of the previews of Spider-Man as long as they could.
Went.
Oh, you were great.
I was the first critic to go and actually write a review of it, and was attacked by the Times for doing it, although ultimately they broke the embargo too and decided to go in. Similarly with Glengarry Glen Ross and the fact that it was an abbreviated run which created a frenzied market for tickets,
Right.
that were being sold, as I said, for $500, $600, $700 a pop. That had nothing to do with theater. That wasn't about creating theater. That was about greed.
Well, do you think that the producers or the marketing people or publicists or whatever would just as soon minimize this?
Minimize the critics.
Minimize the critics.
Sure. Yeah, they've
would
always
just
been trying
like to see you not a factor at all.
I think for the most part they would, unless we support what they're doing. And,
Yeah, right.
you know, the irony of that is there are so many theater artists today who really owe their careers, not to take anything away from their talent, but whose careers have been made by critics devoted to them. Whether it's Claudia Cassidy with Tennessee Williams in Chicago, or the number of us, not just Frank Rich at the New York Times, but the number of us who love and support Stephen Sondheim's work and have for years and years and years.
Or supporting the small theater companies like Playwrights Horizons.
Or supporting,
Or Wynn.
you know, Under the Radar Festival, which is coming up in January. I think one of the most valuable contributions to New York City culture down at the Public Theater. Fantastic, but would it move forward without the support of critics? Hard to know.
I mean, your job is not just to tear down, but also to shine a light on something that's good.
It's the most appealing and the most rewarding part of the job.
One of the things I always, admired about your writing was that you're, as good a critic as you are, you're also a damn fine reporter, which many critics aren't. I mean, I can think of some of our colleagues, I won't name them, but can you imagine if you had to send them out there to find a story? They wouldn't be able to do it. And you always brought a love not only for the art form itself, but I think you love the business of it. You love the behind the scenes, the colorful.
Well, it's true. You know, I grew up as an off-Broadway baby, not a Broadway baby. I grew up going to the Theatre de Lys, which is now, of course, the Lucille Ortel, and the Public, and the American Place Theatre. But I always wanted to know what was happening backstage. I always wanted to know who was going to these shows and who was supporting the artists who were involved in them. And then I had the great good luck to be the Broadway reporter at the New York Times for a while, and from there I went to Variety, where I was the chief theater critic, who at the time was also responsible for all the backstage stuff. And I wrote a couple of columns a week and had to do the grosses and get involved in all that nitty-gritty stuff. And part of it made me very sympathetic to producers. I rarely attack producers for doing whatever they can, even if it's haranguing me on the telephone for protecting their child. That's their job. It doesn't mean that I have to accede to their wishes.
Right.
Hard as some of them, who shall go nameless, may try, but that's their job. That's what they do.
of all the producers you covered and jousted with, who'd you have the most fun with?
Oh, Garth.
Garth Drabinsky.
Garth Drabinsky, because as you well know, you and I know better, I think, than just about anybody on the planet. He was a rascal who was enormously entertaining to follow because you knew everything he was telling you was a lie, and that this house of cards was going to crash, and that when everybody else was looking at whether it was Mike Ovitz buying a piece of his company, we were saying, no, you're looking at the wrong person.
That's right. That's right. That's right. No, I remember those days. Well, all right. The book is Wynn Place Show. Wynn Handman is sort of the opposite of a Garth Drabinsky. The man does not tell a lie, right? And he was not about the money. And
he still goes on.
And he still goes on.
Yeah, but you know what they have in common? What? To give Garth his due, they both love talent.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That is very true. And Garth certainly paid for that talent over this. All right, Wynn Place Show, a new book about Wynn Handman and the American Place Theater. Jeremy, thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure having you on the show today.
Great fun.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
Our thanks to the Friends of Theater Talk for their significant contribution to this production. Theater Talk is made possible in part by the Frederick Lowe Foundation, the Eleanor Naylor Dana Charitable Trust, the Corey and Bob Donnelly Charitable Fund, the Noel Coward Foundation, Carrie J. Fries, the Dorothy Strelson Foundation, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and the New York State Council on the Arts, a state agency.
We welcome your questions or comments for Theater Talk. Thank you and good night.